Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into a shadowy and seldom discussed part of post-World War II history. We're going to explore the U.S. government's recruitment of former Nazis.
Yeah, it's a tangled web for sure. We'll be unpacking Christopher Simpson's Blowback. It pulls back the curtain on the U.S. intelligence community's dealings with former Nazis in the early Cold War.
Okay, so the Cold War is heating up. The U.S. is laser-focused on the Soviet threat. How did they end up turning to former Nazis for help?
Well, the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, they started using former Nazis as informants in occupied Germany right after the war. It seemed practical at the time. You know who knew more about Germany? Who had established networks, who vehemently opposed communism?
Right.
Former Nazi.
A former CIC agent, Gene Bramall, even said, "Who knew Germany better than anyone else? Who were the most organized? Who were the most anti-communist? Former Nazis." Yeah, it's a chilling thought.
It is, and it didn't stop there. As the Cold War intensified, the U.S. saw even more potential in German scientists and engineers. This led to Operation Paperclip.
Operation Paperclip. I've heard whispers about Operation Paperclip. Sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller, bringing over hundreds of German scientists to gain a technological edge.
Exactly. 765 German scientists and engineers, to be precise. However, it's estimated at least half, if not more, were former Nazi Party members, brought over to help the U.S., particularly in rocketry and aerospace.
Hold on. Are we talking about people potentially involved in war crimes?
Unfortunately, yes. One example is Arthur Rudolph. He was instrumental in developing the Saturn V rocket, the one that powered the Apollo missions to the moon. However, it later surfaced that Rudolph had been involved in persecuting prisoners at the Middlework. It was a factory using slave labor to build V-2 rockets. He was ultimately forced to relinquish his U.S. citizenship and leave the country.
Wow, a complicated legacy to say the least. So we have former Nazis as informants, scientists recruited for their expertise. Was there more to this story?
Oh, there's more. Remember Reinhard Gehlen, the former Wehrmacht general who led German military intelligence on the Eastern Front during the war?
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting. A high-ranking intelligence official. Now we're talking. Show me everything.
Gehlen was a goldmine of information. He knew Soviet military operations inside and out. Plus, he had a vast network of informants. After the war, he approached the U.S. with an offer they couldn't refuse.
Let me guess, to spy on the Soviets.
You got it. The U.S. saw Gehlen as an invaluable asset in the burgeoning Cold War. They helped him establish the Gehlen Organization, which later evolved into West Germany's intelligence service, the BND.
So the U.S. was essentially bankrolling a former Nazi's intelligence network.
Essentially, yes, and it gets even more complex. Gehlen staffed his organization with, you guessed it, former Nazis and collaborators, some of whom had served in the SS, SD, and even the Gestapo.
That's alarming. What were the repercussions of working with these people? Did this strategy backfire?
It's a question that has puzzled historians for decades. There's this concept called blowback, the unforeseen consequences of covert operations. The U.S.'s reliance on former Nazis seems to have caused some serious blowback.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about this blowback. What happened?
Well, there's compelling evidence that the Gehlen Organization, although possessing insider knowledge, they fed the U.S. inaccurate intelligence about the Soviets. They consistently overestimated Soviet military strength and intentions.
So they were not only morally questionable allies, but also potentially misleading the U.S.?
Sadly, yes. The U.S. relied heavily on the Gehlen Organization. So much so that this flawed intelligence may have shaped their perception of the Soviet threat. It fed the distrust and hostility that characterized the Cold War.
Wow, so the U.S. was getting played on multiple levels. This is mind-blowing. What other ramifications emerged from this "let's work with former Nazis" strategy? Did it affect anything beyond intelligence gathering?
Unfortunately, yes. The recruitment of former Nazis wasn't limited to intelligence. It seeped into other areas like covert operations and even political warfare.
Now, this is a rabbit hole I'm ready to dive into. What kind of covert operations are we talking about?
After the war, a movement gained traction within U.S. political circles to roll back communism in Eastern Europe. This meant supporting anti-communist resistance movements behind the Iron Curtain.
Okay, that makes sense in theory. But how did former Nazis fit into this?
This is where the ethical lines get even blurrier. In pursuing these objectives, the U.S. employed former Nazi collaborators. They used them within these anti-communist organizations.
You're kidding. Not only were they working with former high-ranking intelligence officials, but also embedding former Nazis in resistance movements.
It's true. In the name of fighting a greater evil, they overlooked their past actions. Believing they could control these former Nazis, leverage their knowledge and networks, and keep them in check.
And did it go according to plan?
You're catching on quickly. These former Nazis often had their own agendas, proving not so easy to manipulate.
I can only imagine the fallout. Can we look at a specific example of one of these Nazi collaborators and their impact?
Absolutely. Mykola Lebed is a particularly striking case. Are you familiar with him?
Can't say that I am. Tell me more.
Lebed was a high-ranking figure in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN, during the war.
Okay. What did this organization stand for? Were they pro-Nazi?
It's complicated. The OUN's main goal was Ukrainian independence. They saw the chaos of the war as a chance to achieve it, even if it meant initially siding with the Nazis.
So a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. However, Lebed was responsible for truly horrific acts during the war. Mass murders, ethnic cleansing, brutal suppression of anyone considered an enemy, including Jews and Poles.
That's horrifying. And the U.S. was willing to work with someone with that kind of past? It's hard to fathom.
Remember the Cold War mindset? The U.S. was prepared to make morally questionable decisions in the name of national security.
So pragmatism trumped ethics.
It appears that way. They saw Lebed as a valuable asset with experience in organizing resistance, covert operations, and intelligence gathering. They essentially swept his wartime activities under the rug.
This is unbelievable. What became of him after the war? Did he ever face consequences for his actions?
That's what's truly disheartening. Instead of being held accountable for his crimes, Lebed was brought to the U.S. He was given a new identity and allowed to live freely, avoiding prosecution.
No way! You're kidding?
It's true. He even continued working with the U.S. government, advising on Ukrainian affairs and assisting with covert operations against the Soviets.
So a mass murderer was on the U.S. payroll, living comfortably under their protection. This is shocking.
It's a dark chapter in U.S. history that many would prefer to forget. However, it's important to acknowledge these uncomfortable truths, these compromises during the Cold War, and how they continue to have implications today.
Absolutely. What about the effects on the Ukrainian people? How did they view the U.S. supporting someone like Lebed?
That's an important point. By aligning with individuals like Lebed, the U.S. undermined its own moral authority and inadvertently legitimized the very ideologies they claimed to oppose.
So their actions were actually counterproductive in the long run.
Exactly. The Soviet Union used this alliance with former Nazis as propaganda, portraying the U.S. as hypocrites no better than the Nazis they defeated.
Talk about a tangled web they wove. What a mess.
And it gets even more tangled when we consider the lasting implications of these decisions. The U.S.'s use of former Nazis had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate goals of the Cold War.
I think we need to hit pause here. There's so much to unpack. Don't go anywhere. We'll delve deeper into this hidden history in our next installment. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Let's pick up where we left off, grappling with the U.S. government's recruitment of former Nazis during the Cold War.
Yeah. And specifically, we are examining the case of Mykola Lebed, a high-ranking figure in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN. His story really highlights the moral tightrope the U.S. was walking.
Right. We're talking about a man accused of horrific war crimes.
Yeah.
Being sheltered in the U.S. and even advising the government.
Yeah.
What were the long-term consequences of such a morally fraught alliance?
Well, it severely damaged America's reputation. How could the U.S. championing democracy and freedom collaborate with someone like Lebed who had participated in such atrocities? It created a glaring contradiction.
Right. It seems like a recipe for disaster, especially when trying to win hearts and minds during the Cold War. Did this backfire on them?
Absolutely. The Soviet Union exploited these hypocrisies masterfully in their propaganda. They pointed to these alliances as proof the U.S. was no different from the Nazis they claimed to have vanquished.
Wow. It makes you wonder how that played out in countries trying to decide whether to align with the U.S. or the USSR.
You're spot on. It significantly eroded U.S. credibility, particularly for nations emerging from colonial rule and seeking a model for their future.
So not only morally wrong, but also strategically unwise.
Precisely. It exemplifies the pitfalls of prioritizing short-term gains over long-term consequences. The U.S., fixated on winning the Cold War, often failed to grasp the broader implications of its actions.
Right. Were there other instances of this blowback stemming directly from the recruitment of former Nazis?
The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 is a stark example.
The Hungarian Uprising. A brave yet tragic fight for freedom from Soviet control. How were former Nazis involved in that event?
Well, through Radio Free Europe, the U.S. had been encouraging resistance movements in Hungary and other Eastern European countries. They broadcast messages of support, even hinting at military intervention, if these nations revolted against the Soviets.
So essentially, they fueled the fires of rebellion, suggesting they'd back up the resistance with action.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Inspired by these broadcasts, many Hungarians took to the streets believing the U.S. would support them.
Right. A tragic story of misplaced hope.
Indeed. The U.S. wasn't prepared for a full-scale confrontation with the Soviets over Hungary. When the Soviets crushed the uprising, the U.S. offered only words, not action.
Oh, wow. That must have been devastating for the Hungarians, feeling betrayed by the very nation that had spurred them to action.
Absolutely. Many who participated in the uprising felt used and abandoned, and that's where the blowback hit hard.
Right. I imagine the Soviets took full advantage, using it to further discredit the U.S. and tighten their grip on Eastern Europe.
Precisely. The Hungarian Revolution became a cautionary tale, a stark illustration of the dangers of trusting in promises of liberation that lacked genuine commitment.
Wow, what a heavy price to pay for a short-sighted strategy. It seems this "let's work with former Nazis" approach was flawed from the outset.
It's a complex and controversial chapter. It raises uncomfortable questions about the moral compromises made in the name of national security.
It really does. It reminds us that history isn't about simple right and wrong. It's full of murky compromises and unforeseen consequences.
Absolutely. And it underscores that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about the choices individuals and nations make and the lasting impact those choices have on the world.
The U.S.'s recruitment of former Nazis certainly seems like a gamble that backfired, leaving a legacy of distrust, betrayal, and unintended consequences that we're still grappling with today.
You're right. However, it's crucial to remember that not everyone agreed with this approach. Blowback isn't just about exposing these operations. It also sheds light on those who bravely fought to bring these injustices to the surface.
That's right. There were journalists, historians, and even some within the government who spoke out against this alliance with former Nazis.
Right.
They understood that partnering with such individuals undermined the very values the U.S. claimed to uphold.
Precisely. They believed that the ends did not justify the means. One prominent example was the journalist Drew Pearson. He was relentless in his investigations, a constant thorn in the side of the U.S. government.
He sounds like a true crusader for truth. What kind of pushback did he face? I can't imagine the government was thrilled about having their secrets exposed.
You're right. Pearson faced harsh criticism and immense pressure from the government. They tried to discredit him, even branding him a communist sympathizer, all to silence him.
Wow. A classic tactic to shift focus away from the real issue. Did he back down?
Not a chance. He was undeterred. Continuing to publish his findings and raise public awareness of these covert operations and their ethical implications, his work ignited a much-needed debate about the U.S.'s role in the Cold War and the compromises being made.
He sounds like a true hero, fighting for truth and justice. Were there others who joined him in this fight?
Absolutely. Historians started digging into declassified government documents, slowly uncovering the extent of the U.S.'s collaboration with former Nazis. It was an uphill battle. The government had gone to great lengths to conceal evidence of these operations.
It sounds like something straight out of the spy novel. Secret files, cover-ups, the truth hidden in plain sight.
It's not far off. But despite the obstacles, they persisted, piecing together a hidden history and challenging the official narrative of the Cold War. They revealed a much more complicated and frankly disturbing picture.
Right. It's a stark reminder that history is not set in stone. It's constantly being reevaluated and reinterpreted as new evidence emerges, and it highlights the vital role of investigative journalism and historical research in exposing uncomfortable truth and holding those in power accountable.
Perfectly said. These individuals were instrumental in bringing the U.S.'s dealings with former Nazis to light. Their tireless efforts sparked a conversation about the ethical boundaries of national security and the need for greater transparency from our government.
That conversation continues today, as we still grapple with these very issues. The lessons from the Cold War, though troubling, can guide us as we navigate our complex world and make more informed choices about the future.
You're absolutely right. History isn't just a collection of past events. It's a roadmap for the present and a cautionary tale for the future. By understanding the mistakes made, we can hopefully avoid repeating them and work towards a world where such moral compromises are no longer deemed necessary.
Well said. The story of the U.S. recruiting former Nazis is a powerful reminder of the importance of critical thinking, ethical decision-making, and relentlessly pursuing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. But we're not done yet. There's still so much to explore. We'll be back for our final installment of this deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of the U.S. government's recruitment of former Nazis after World War II.
Yeah, and this final part of our deep dive takes us to the heart of some serious ethical and legal dilemmas. How did the U.S. handle former enemies who might have committed war crimes?
It's a moral minefield, right? On one hand, you want justice for war crimes. On the other, you're in the thick of the Cold War, and these individuals suddenly represent potential assets. Tough spot.
Indeed, a difficult balance to strike. In some instances, the U.S. actively shielded former Nazis from prosecution. They even went so far as to provide them with new identities and safe haven abroad.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
Are there any specific cases that illustrate this?
The case of Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, is particularly chilling. He was a high-ranking Gestapo officer responsible for countless acts of torture and murder during the war. After the war, the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps recruited him. They used him as an informant on communist activities.
Wow, it's hard to believe they would overlook such horrific crimes.
Yeah.
Just because he had useful information.
Sadly, that's exactly what happened, and when France requested his extradition to face trial for his war crimes, the U.S. helped him escape. He lived comfortably in South America for decades before finally being brought to justice.
It's astounding that someone like Barbie could evade accountability for so long, especially with the U.S. government aiding him. Did this cover-up have any repercussions for the U.S.?
Oh, when Barbie's past came to light, it created a huge scandal, further tarnishing the U.S.'s reputation and straining relations with their allies. It really highlighted the potential for blowback, making deals with the devil even in the name of national security.
So this strategy of using former Nazis, it wasn't just morally questionable, but it also seems to have backfired strategically in many ways. Did the U.S. government ever own up to these mistakes?
Well, there have been attempts to address this dark chapter. In the 1970s, Congress established the Office of Special Investigations, the OSI, within the Justice Department, specifically to investigate and prosecute Nazi war criminals residing in the United States.
Okay, so that sounds like a step towards accountability. But what about the bigger picture? Did the U.S. government ever truly acknowledge its role in these events?
That's a more complicated question. There have been investigations and reports, but no outright admission of wrongdoing, or a comprehensive effort to address the underlying reasons for these decisions. The CIA, in particular, has been very reluctant to release documents or acknowledge its involvement.
Yeah, it's frustrating that a more thorough reckoning hasn't happened. It feels like there are still so many unanswered questions, a reluctance to fully confront the moral implications.
You're right. It highlights that pursuing historical accountability is a continuous process. It requires us to remain vigilant and be willing to challenge official narratives even when they're uncomfortable.
That brings us back to the importance of books like Blowback. They shine a light on these hidden parts of history, forcing us to confront difficult truths.
Absolutely. These books, along with the tireless work of investigative journalists and historians, play a crucial role. They make sure that these stories are not forgotten and that we learn from them.
So what can we take away from all this? Why should these events from decades ago matter to us today?
Well, I think there are several key takeaways from our deep dive into Blowback. First, it reminds us that history is not just a linear timeline of events. It's a complex web of choices, compromises, and unintended consequences.
Right.
Second, it highlights the dangers of prioritizing political expediency over ethical principles. And finally, it underscores the crucial importance of transparency and accountability in government, especially when it comes to matters of intelligence and national security.
Yeah, these lessons still resonate in our world today, a world grappling with similar challenges and moral dilemmas. The past might be over, but its influence on the present and the future is undeniable.
Exactly. As we navigate the complexities of today's world, we would do well to remember these lessons from the past. We should strive to make informed choices that align with our values and uphold the principles of justice and human dignity.
This deep dive into Blowback has been a real eye-opener. It's a stark reminder that even in the face of global threats, some lines should never be crossed. Thanks for joining us on this journey through a shadowy chapter of history. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and never stop seeking the truth.